Have I not been arrested?
Hey, listen.
Hold on. Lawsuit. Lawsuit.
Hey, can you listen?
Bro, I don't want to hear none of that. Bro, have I been arrested?
You gonna listen?
Have I been arrested?
Do you have identification on you? I don't believe that's necessary right now, officer. If there's confusion, call your director. For nearly 12 seconds, the body cam footage stays silent except for traffic noise and police radios crackling in the background. Then one officer steps away, types a name into the system, and suddenly his posture changes completely. You need to call the supervisor right now. What started as a routine stop outside a suburban home turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments that department had faced in years, because the man standing in handcuffs beside his own vehicle wasn't just another resident refusing to identify himself. He was an undercover FBI representative actively involved in an ongoing federal operation nearby. And according to later reports, local officers had no idea who they had stopped, why he was there, or how quickly the situation was about to spiral out of control. The question is not whether police can ask someone for identification. They usually can. The question is what happens when authority, confusion, and ego collide before anyone slows down long enough to understand the situation. They rely on you not knowing your rights. This channel makes sure you do. Subscribe and stay informed. And if you believe more people need to see this, share it and let me know your thoughts in the comments. The man at the center of the incident was 46-year-old Daniel Mercer, a longtime federal investigator assigned to a multi-agency task force focused on organized financial crimes and narcotics trafficking. Neighbors described him as quiet, professional, and almost invisible in the neighborhood. Most people had no idea what he actually did for work, and that was intentional. On the night of the incident, Mercer had reportedly been conducting surveillance connected to an ongoing federal operation less than 2 miles away. According to later statements, federal agents had been monitoring suspected movement tied to an ongoing investigation involving stolen firearms and interstate trafficking. Mercer had returned briefly to his home to swap vehicles and retrieve equipment before heading back out. That's when local patrol officers noticed him. According to police radio traffic later reviewed by investigators, officers had received a vague report about a suspicious vehicle sitting near a residential intersection earlier that evening. The description loosely matched Mercer's SUV. At first, officers reportedly believed they were dealing with possible casing activity or someone surveilling homes. But here's where things became complicated. Mercer had already parked near his driveway and exited his vehicle when patrol units pulled up behind him with lights activated. From Mercer's perspective, he likely thought officers simply wanted to ask questions. From the officer's perspective, they believed they were approaching someone tied to suspicious behavior in the area. And within seconds, the tone changed completely. "Sir, stay where you are." Body cam footage reportedly showed Mercer standing near the front walkway of his home with his hands partially raised. "What's going on, officer?" "We got calls about this vehicle moving around the neighborhood. Need your ID." Mercer remained calm. "I live here." "Okay, identification." Now, this is important. Mercer did not immediately refuse cooperation. According to reports, he questioned why identification was necessary. "I'm on private property. Am I being detained?" One officer answered quickly, "Yes, right now you are." "For what crime?" "We're investigating suspicious activity." The exchange lasted less than a minute before tension increased. Another officer approached closer. "Turn around for me." "What? Why?" "Because you're not complying." At that point, Mercer reportedly tried to explain that there were larger circumstances involved and suggested officers contact a federal supervisor. "If there's confusion, call your director. This can get cleared up fast." But the officers appeared to interpret that statement as evasive. One officer later stated in his report that Mercer's refusal to immediately produce identification heightened suspicion. And this is where body cam encounters often shift from investigation to escalation. The officers repeatedly demanded identification. Mercer repeatedly asked whether he was legally required to provide it. Then came the moment that changed everything. One officer grabbed Mercer's wrist. "Hands behind your back." "You're making a mistake." "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting." Within seconds, Mercer was handcuffed near the hood of his own vehicle while neighbors watched from nearby porches. One officer began searching his pockets. Another ran his information through state and federal databases after eventually locating identification credentials inside Mercer's jacket. Then the atmosphere changed instantly. The officer looking at the screen reportedly froze for a moment before speaking quietly into his radio. Supervisor requested immediately. At this point, the legal question becomes extremely important. Can police demand identification from someone standing outside their own home? Generally, it depends on the circumstances and the state. In many jurisdictions, officers can ask anyone for identification during a consensual encounter, but asking is different from legally requiring someone to provide it. Usually, for police to compel identification, they need lawful reasonable suspicion that a crime is occurring, has occurred, or is about to occur. That standard comes from long-established constitutional principles tied to temporary investigatory detentions. Now, reasonable suspicion is not the same as probable cause. It's a lower threshold. Officers do not need proof beyond doubt, but they typically need specific, articulable facts suggesting criminal activity. And that's where this incident becomes controversial. The officers reportedly relied on a vague, suspicious vehicle call from earlier in the evening. Courts often examine whether anonymous or generalized suspicious activity reports are enough by themselves to justify detention. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are not. A court may look at factors like behavior, location, time of day, matching descriptions, evasiveness, or whether the officers observed independent suspicious conduct themselves. But another important issue is location. Mercer was reportedly already on or near his own property when officers detained him. That does not automatically prevent police interaction, but courts often scrutinize detentions more carefully when someone is stopped at home without clear evidence of criminal conduct. And then there's the identification issue itself. In some states, stop and identify laws may require a detained person to identify themselves under certain conditions. In others, refusing to identify yourself may not be a crime unless additional factors are involved. So, legally speaking, the officers may argue they were conducting a lawful investigatory detention. Mercer's side would likely argue there was never enough reasonable suspicion to justify handcuffing him and searching him in the first place. And this is where officer discretion matters. Because even when officers technically have authority to investigate, the way they exercise that authority can completely change the outcome. Back on scene, the tension kept building. Body cam audio reportedly captured one officer saying he kept refusing commands, but Mercer's response was immediate. "I asked what crime you think I committed." Neighbors later said Mercer never yelled, threatened officers, or attempted to flee. Still, officers continued treating the encounter as potentially dangerous. One officer opened Mercer's vehicle door. Another asked dispatch whether federal credentials found in his jacket were authentic. Then came the moment nobody expected. Dispatch confirmed the identification belonged to an active FBI representative assigned to a federal task force. According to reports, there was immediate confusion among responding officers because Mercer's status triggered restricted database notifications. One officer reportedly muttered, "Oh no." Another stepped away from the scene entirely and placed a phone call. Now the body cam footage reportedly shows something fascinating. The officer's tone changes almost instantly. The commands stop, the aggressive posture softens, and suddenly the same officers who had threatened arrest moments earlier began trying to explain themselves. "Sir, we didn't know. I told you to call your director." But Mercer wasn't released immediately. And that matters, because once officers realized who they were dealing with, the legal exposure for the department became much larger. Not because Mercer was FBI, but because the central question became whether the detention itself was lawful before they knew his identity. Now we get into the deeper constitutional issues. First is the handcuffing. Courts generally allow temporary handcuffing during investigatory detentions under limited circumstances, especially if officers reasonably believe someone may be dangerous or could flee. But handcuffs can also transform a temporary stop into what legally resembles an arrest, and if that happens without probable cause, departments can face serious legal problems. A court reviewing this case would likely examine several questions. Did officers genuinely fear for safety? Did Mercer physically resist? Did officers have evidence connecting him to criminal conduct? Or did the situation escalate mainly because he questioned their authority? That distinction matters enormously. Another issue involves the pocket search and vehicle access. Generally, officers can conduct limited protective searches during lawful detentions if they reasonably suspect weapons may be present. But broader searches often require consent, probable cause, or another recognized exception. Departments also have internal policies about de-escalation and professional conduct, and something can technically survive constitutional review while still violating department policy or accepted policing standards. That's important because accountability is not only about legality, it's also about judgment. Did the officers have legal authority? Maybe, but having authority does not automatically mean the decision was wise, ethical, or necessary. A calm conversation outside a residence became a handcuffing incident involving federal law enforcement because nobody slowed the situation down early enough. Within days, the incident reportedly triggered internal review discussions between local leadership and federal supervisors. No criminal charges against Mercer were ever filed. That alone became significant because departments often argued detentions were justified by unfolding investigations. But when no underlying offense is identified, public scrutiny increases fast. Mercer reportedly filed a formal complaint alleging unlawful detention, unnecessary force, and interference with an active federal operation. The department initially defended the officers publicly, stating they were responding to suspicious activity complaints and following standard procedure. But body cam footage complicated that narrative. Public reaction became sharply divided. Some viewers believed the officers acted reasonably based on limited information. Others argued the entire encounter escalated because officers treated a calm citizen's questions as defiance. Civil rights commentators focused heavily on one issue: whether citizens can safely assert constitutional rights without immediately risking detention. Meanwhile, former law enforcement officials reviewing the footage reportedly noted another problem common in modern policing: ego escalation. Once Mercer questioned the officer's authority, the interaction appeared to become more personal and confrontational. Several months later, reports indicated the department implemented additional training related to investigatory detentions, identification requests, and de-escalation during ambiguous encounters. Whether that training came directly because of Mercer's case remains unclear. So, who was right here? The answer is more complicated than many people want. The officers were not wrong to investigate a suspicious vehicle call. Police are expected to respond to citizen complaints, especially late at night in residential neighborhoods. And officers often face uncertainty during first contact. They do not know who they are approaching or whether someone may be armed. That concern is real. But concern alone does not automatically justify escalation. Mercer appears to have remained verbally calm throughout most of the interaction. Asking whether you are detained and asking why identification is required are not, by themselves, threats. And this is where the situation seems to have gone off track. Instead of slowing down and clarifying the legal basis for detention, officers moved quickly toward control tactics: handcuffs, pocket searches, repeated commands. Once that happens, people often stop feeling like they're part of an investigation and start feeling like they're being punished for non-compliance. And there's another uncomfortable reality here. Many viewers asked whether the officers would have de-escalated so quickly if Mercer had not turned out to be federal law enforcement. That question matters because constitutional protections are supposed to apply equally to everyone, not just officials, not just federal agents. Everyone. At the same time, Mercer probably understood better than most citizens how roadside confrontations can escalate. Some critics argued he could have simply identified himself immediately and avoided the entire situation. But others countered that constitutional rights are tested precisely in moments where people choose to assert them. And this is why accountability matters. Not every bad police encounter comes from corruption or malice. Sometimes it comes from impatience, assumptions, poor communication, and officers treating hesitation as hostility. The biggest lesson from this case is not about the FBI. It's about escalation. Most roadside encounters begin with uncertainty. Officers are gathering information, citizens are trying to understand why they're being stopped, and those first 30 seconds often determine everything that follows. Remaining calm matters. Arguing aggressively on the roadside usually makes situations worse. Documenting what happened matters. Asking whether you are free to leave matters. And if questioning becomes serious, asking for legal counsel matters too. But this incident also reminds departments that authority should be exercised carefully, especially during ambiguous situations where no immediate threat exists. Because once officers move from conversation to force, it becomes very difficult to rebuild trust. And in this case, what began as a suspicious vehicle call ended with a federal operative in handcuffs outside his own home, all because nobody paused long enough to reassess the situation before escalating it. So now the question goes to you. Do you think this was lawful police work under difficult circumstances, or did these officers take a routine situation way too far?